I don't like when you watch somebody and they do it perfectly because it's edited. The magic of TV and everything. I messed up here. We need to cut these at 6.5 inches. And if I line up my ruler and I squared off the dog ears, I need to be able to, I'll show you with washi tape. I was going to show you how to use washi tape to create a guide for yourself, but I need to be able to get clear down here with my fabric. This is where 6.5 is. So something went wrong. And I'm going to figure out what that is, and I will let you know. Hey everyone, I'm Taylor Brantley. Welcome back to the Crafty Quilter. If this is your first time here, I will leave a link up here to the first part of this series, Create a Quilt 101. This is part 3, which is HalfSquare Triangles, which I am super eager to do. It's one of my favorite blocks. And part 1 was color theory and fabric selection. And then part 2 is 4 patch blocks. And so if you need to get up to speed, I will leave links in the description for that. Today I'm going to show you how to make HalfSquare triangles 2 at a time, and then I will take it up a notch and show you how to make them 8 at a time. So let's not waste any time. Let's just get to it. Alright, so for our 2 at a time HalfSquare triangle blocks, we are going to be making all of our blocks today at finish at 6 inches, just like we did for our 4 patches last week. And if we refer to the instructions in the PDF, which is linked below, to make 2 at a time HalfSquare triangles which finish at 6 inches, we need to cut them at 7 inches. And that's going to give us a good amount of wiggle room for trimming them, which I like to have. So I'm going to go ahead and, just like I showed you last week, we're going to go ahead and pick our fabric. I'm going to make sure to line up. I'm using my shape cut again, but of course you can use any ruler that works for you. Make sure I'm lined up. My selvages are my fold, my selvages, and my other fold are all lined up. I'm gonna go ahead and line up my shape cut, and we're gonna cut a 7-inch strip. I'm gonna go ahead and square off and clean up at the 0, and then cut a 7-inch strip. Now I'm going to go ahead and subcut this into 7-inch squares. And this is definitely going to need ironed, but it's not super wrinkly, so it should be fine for cutting, and I will just iron it in a moment. Press it in a moment. So again, I need to cut this selvage off. 7 inches. There's 2 of them. So that will make 4 HalfSquare triangles. And then I can get another 7 out of here. There's 2 more. And then if I open this up, I'll be able to get 1 more. So 5 7-inch squares, that's going to get us 10 HalfSquare triangles. And that is a scrap. I'm going to go ahead and do the same with my coordinated fabric. One thing too with the shape cut that I've noticed that I really like is that this, from the edge to the 0 is actually 2 inches. So if I'm going to cut two 7-inch squares and it's 12 inches here, 12 plus the 2 is going to be 14. So if I go ahead and use my edge here as, and then I cut 2 plus 5 is 7. So I'll go ahead and cut on 5. Plus 7 is 12. And that way I can get a couple more and I don't have to move it around quite as much. This fabric is a little bit wider, so I can get actually 6 squares out of that. So these squares definitely need pressed, and I'm going to go ahead and do that. I am not, again, I'm not going to be swishing around and pressing down because I don't want to get my fabric out of shape. And as I'm sliding, I'm really like picking it up and putting no pressure on the fabric. I want to show you, one thing I want to show you is the difference between a fabric that has extra sizing or starch in it and a fabric that doesn't. So I've got 2 pieces here, and I haven't pre-washed these. We talked about that in last week's video, in the fabric preparation portion of last week's video, but I want to show you, both of these have sizing in them because they haven't been washed. The starch hasn't been removed, but there's not a ton. And so I like to use, we're going to be sewing on the bias here and having some bias seams. And just so you can see, so fabric is threads woven together at a 90-degree angle. And it's not, this one's a little bit, but it's not very stretchy on this straight of grain here. But in this direction, it's very stretchy. And so it's easy to get your fabric stretched out of shape if you're making things that are on the bias. Now, something that helps to prevent that is the sizing. And of course, as I said, these still have sizing in them, but if we are worried about our bias seams, particularly if we're a newer quilter or if we're using a lower thread count quilt fabric, like if you buy your fabric from a chain, or if you're not spending much money on it, which is completely fair if you're a brand new quilter, why would you want to spend a ton of money on fabric that and you're not sure it's going to work out? Then you might need to add some extra sizing to make sure that you're going to get better results. So you can do starch, of course, or there's other alternatives. I prefer Mary Ellen's Best Press. I have it in a couple of scents. I like citrus the best, but I have lavender here. So what you're going to do, you're just going to lightly spray it, and then you're going to press your fabric to dry it. And just make sure. And they have scent free as well, which is nice if you're bothered by the smells. But so let me show you the difference. So you can already tell just by looking at how kind of floppy this one is versus this one that I've starched, that this one's gonna stand up better. So this is the stretchiness of the bias on the unstarched one, and this is on the starched one. So it's still going to be stretchy. You're not going to be able to prevent that entirely, but you're going to help yourself by doing this. As I said, especially on fabrics that are like a lower thread count. So I'm going to go ahead and do that with all of these. I've brought my cut and starched blocks over to the sewing machine. Before we start sewing, one more step that we need to do is that I need to mark on the backs of some of these. So I'm going to go ahead and do that on my lighter one so that I can see my markings better. Hello, sir. So I'm going to go ahead and mark on the back of my light one. So I'm going to flip them over. And what we're going to do is we're going to mark a line from one corner to the other, a straight line. And I use a regular mechanical pencil. You want to use a writing utensil that's going to have a fine point so that you don't end up with this really thick line that you're using as a guide. So I like to use a nice mechanical pencil. You can use a pen, but be careful what you use because it may bleed in your final quilt. So obviously there are chalk pencils and disappearing ink pens and things that are made for quilting and for sewing that you can use as well. Just make sure that the tip is nice and sharp. So what we'll do is we're gonna, as I said, go from one point to the other. And I'm doing this really lightly because I don't want to stretch my fabric out of shape. Are you able to see that? I'm gonna switch to, again, I probably normally wouldn't do this with a ballpoint pen because it may bleed in my final quilt, but I'm gonna go ahead and switch just because I don't have another option that is dark enough for you to see. So I wouldn't do it quite so bold. Normally I would just do the mechanical pencil, but I'll go ahead and do this. So I'm going to go ahead and get them all marked, and then I'll show you how to chain piece these to do a bunch of them at a time. Okay, so that's all my blocks marked and set that aside. And now what we're going to do is we're going to pair each of these face together with our block that it goes with. So I'm going to go ahead and line them up on all the sides as best as possible. If they're a little off, like it looks like my blue one, I don't know. I think because I was stretching this one to show you guys, it's a little bit off, but we'll take care of that when we trim it. So I've got them lined up. I'm going to go ahead and pin, and I'm going to pin a couple different places here. And I'm pinning from one side of the line to the other because I want to hold where that line is down. So, and I'll get another one ready as well. We're going to chain piece this. Kind of like in our 4 patches last week, we were chain piecing there, and I want to show you how to chain piece these as well. So you can make a bunch of them real fast. All right. So now we're going to get our sewing machine. I have on my machine today my normal kind of standard, this is a zigzag foot, and it doesn't have a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's a little bit more than a 1/4 inch for mine. But again, that's okay because I have quite a bit of wiggle room in here. So we're just going to use the edge of our foot as our guide. So I'm going to line up the side of my presser foot with this line and go ahead and follow it all the way down. Now I don't have to do anything about a scant 1/4 inch like we talked about last time or anything like that because again, it's built into the wiggle room and we're going to cut our seam allowance afterwards. So let me go ahead and get this on here. Now, as I told you guys last time, I'm going to go ahead and hold my threads back here taut, not tight, but taut. And then I've got my presser foot lined up here to my line that I've drawn on my fabric. And I'm going to go ahead and sew a straight line across the whole block. As I come up to a pin, I'm going to pause and take the pin out and continue. I was not paying attention. I almost ran that one over. And as you can see, I'm very lightly just guiding it. I'm not pushing or pulling my fabric. I'm letting the feed dogs that are underneath pull the fabric through. I'm just guiding where it's going. All right, so we've sewn my needle is off the block, so I'm gonna go ahead and this time I'm gonna go ahead and raise my presser foot so I can get the next one in there. because sometimes if you feed a pointy block like this, it'll get fed down into your feed dog, so you want to be careful about that. So I want to kind of put the block as close as I can to the needle, and then I can continue. And we can continue with all of our blocks. I'm not going to pin them. I'm just going to line them up and kind of wing it. But please, if you want to pin or if you feel like you need to pin, there is no shame in pinning. No shame at all. So I'm going to go ahead and get these chain pieced, and then we'll get them cut apart. Awesome. So we were able to do 5. And I got an upgrade from last time. Those thread snips I was using in the last video were not very good. This is a little, I'll link this. This is not sponsored or I'm not affiliated, but it's fantastic. It's called the BladeSaver. I will link the shop that makes these, their Etsy shop, in the description below. And it uses, you screw in an old rotary blade. So I'm always telling you, you need to change your blade more frequently. This is a good way to reuse them. And you just stick it in here, and you can't stick your finger in it or anything. It's not going to hurt you in that way, but you can use it, and it has little rubber grippies on the bottom. You can use it to cut apart these blocks that we're chain piecing, which is a lot easier, especially if you're going to do a whole bunch of them. It's really nice to have this. You can even cut your little tail off. So I like this thing. I'm excited to have it. All right, so I've got one side sewed down, one line of stitching sewed. It's kind of hard to see because it's white on white. So I'm going to go ahead and do the other side. And I'm not going to pin these at all this time because they're already sewed down. But again, if you feel like you would like to pin, absolutely go for it. Get these trimmed apart. So for each of these, what you're going to do, and you can do this with your rotary cutter or with your scissors, it doesn't really matter, but we're just going to cut right along this line that we drew. And then this is where the magic happens. Now you have 2 beautiful HalfSquare triangle blocks. First thing we're going to do, as always with any block, is I'm going to go ahead and press it flat. Again, I'm not, wiggling or not doing any of this. I'm not being aggressive. This is a bias seam and we want to be careful with it. So just pressing it gently. And then you've got 2 options here. So one is going to be to press your seam open, which is going to give you a flatter seam, and it's going to make, whenever these points come together with other blocks, it's going to spread out your seam allowance so that it's not so bulky. And that's going to give you more options for quilting, more options for hand quilting. If you use a long arm or if you're going to send it out to a long armor, it's going to give you more options. Your other option, and so that's pressed open, and we're gonna have to trim off these little dog ears, but we need to trim it anyway. Or you can press to the side. In order to do that, we're gonna again go ahead and press it. I've got my darker side up because I want to press my seam allowances towards the dark. So dark side up. I'm gonna go ahead and press that seam, and then we can open this so you're seeing your fronts. That's very warm, so be careful. Go ahead and press that with your fingers, and then with your iron. And that, usually I press to the side. I just don't like to take the extra time to press it open, honestly, but it is completely up to you which you're going to do. I think for these, because they're half square triangles and because the intersection, it goes to the point, which means you're going to hit more, you're going to have more intersecting seam allowances, I'm going to go ahead and press all of mine open. So, and you just want to, you're just leading with the tip of your iron, couple fingers away, opening it up with your fingers, and then pressing down with your iron. And then, as always, I like to flip it over, make sure it's flat. This is another step that you could throw some, best press in here to make them nice and crisp. So I'm going to go ahead and do that with all of them. Okay, that's the last one. Let's take these over to our cutting mat so that we can get them squared up. So I'm going to refer again to our chart here. We are making the 6-inch finished block. So that means the unfinished block size needs to be 6.5. So we need to cut this down to 6.5. So in order to do that, I'm going to get a square ruler that has a diagonal line running from one corner. And we're going to use this line to line up with the diagonal seam line. I messed up here. We need to cut these at 6.5 inches. And if I line up my ruler along the edge here, even if I go clear to the edges of my fabric and I squared off the dog ears, I need to be able to, I'll show you with washi tape. I was going to show you how to use washi tape to create a guide for yourself, but I need to be able to get clear down here with my fabric. This is where 6.5 is. So something went wrong. And I'm going to figure out what that is. Okay guys, so I fixed our issue, or the issue I was having. As you can see, this is the pile of the original that I made that wasn't going to be big enough. It's not 6.5 inches. And I fixed that by increasing the block size that we cut out originally. So what I will do, you can see that this is going to be plenty big enough. This is 6.5 right here where the tape is. So we'll be able to trim this down to 6.5. Now, this is going to create a lot more waste than if we had done it with the measurements I gave you previously and done it perfectly with a perfect 1/4 inch. But I discovered that I do not have a piecing foot that is a perfect 1/4 inch piecing foot that doesn't have a ledge. And the one that I use that has a ledge, you can't really use for half square triangles or other types of stitch and flip methods, which is what this is. and we'll go over that a little bit more next week. But you can't use it because the ledge would have to go over your fabric as you're sewing, and it would drag on your fabric and it creates problems. So you really need either a 1/4 inch foot exactly, and I will put a picture up of the one that I could get from my machine that I just don't have because I typically don't need it. Or you can increase the block size you start with. So I'm going to edit the PDF and add in directions or measurements for how to cut your blocks so that you'll have less waste. And then I'll include the measurements that I'm using where I have a larger seam allowance just because my foot is larger and I'm going to have a little bit more waste. Either way, you are going to need to do this next step, which is to trim up your block, which is where we were, and I'm going to show you how to do that now. So I'm going to set these small ones aside, and again, we'll use it in the backing, or I have some smaller blocks that we're going to do later, so maybe I'll pull them out and trim them way down. So let me just throw those aside. So back to trimming, which is where we were before I realized that I had messed up. And you can even see that I like to be able to trim because you can see here, my block is all kinds of wonky. It dips way below this line and above this line. It's sticking out here. It's at the point here. It's really wonky. So that's fine as long as this line's straight and you have enough room to cut. So I am going to show you, you don't have to do this, but this is helpful. I'm going to make a little guide for myself on the back of my ruler for where my 6.5, you can do it on the front of your ruler too, it doesn't really matter, but I'm going to do it on the back. So 6.5 on my ruler is this line right here. And I'm just going to butt my washi tape or painter's tape up against that line. And I'm going to do that on the horizontal as well. This will come in more handy when we do the 3rd and 4th sides. So I'm going to line up my 45-degree angle along my seam line, and I'm going to slide my ruler as far up into this top right corner as I can with there still being a little bit hanging over on each side. So basically what I'm shooting for is I need this line to be lined up with my stitch line. I need there to be a little bit of extra on each side, and I need there to be a little bit extra, or at least it's meeting the 6.5 inch on both sides all the way. So that way I can trim a perfect 6.5 inch square. And then I'm going to use my rotary cutter to trim this side and the top. Just be careful when you're going in that direction. And then I'm gonna flip it around 180 degrees. And again, I'm gonna line up my diagonal line. And this time I'm gonna use my washi tape as the guide for my edges. Or again, you can just use the ruler. You don't have to have the washi tape, but I feel like for you guys to see, it's a little bit easier. So I've got 6.5 down here, 6.5 over here, and my 45-degree angle lined up. So I'm going to cut off the other two sides. And I try to remove the excess before I move my ruler in case something's not totally cut, then I can go back and cut it before I've moved everything. So that is your perfect half square triangle. So I'll show you that one more time. So, and I pressed these, I didn't show that off camera, but I did all the same steps I did initially before I realized they were the wrong size. Okay, so 45-degree angle. I've got plenty of room all the way around. So I'm gonna go ahead and trim two sides. Flip it around. Line up that 45 and my, all kinds of off. See, that's why the washi tape helps. Again, my 45 and both my 6.5s. and trim. Perfect. Let me get the rest of them done. Here we go. 8 6.5 inch half square triangles. They'll finish at 6 when we put them into a quilt. And again, I don't love how much waste this creates, but you're gonna have to trim regardless. And if you're a newer quilter, which it's likely that you are if you're watching this half square triangle video, it may be prudent to start out with the larger measurement and the trimming to get your triangles, to get your squares perfect, versus trying to get your stitching perfect all at once. It's hard to try and get all the things at once. And if you do it this way, you're going to end up with a better quilt because you have more control over what the final block looks like versus trying to be a perfect seamstress the whole way through. I'm going to be using the bows on this green stripe for my 8 at a time half square triangles. And what you need to do for this, I'll put a chart up of the measurements, but for 2 at a time half square triangles that finish at 6 inches with my extra built in so that we can trim, we cut at 7.5 inch squares. We're going to double that. So we're going to cut a 15 inch square out of this and a 15 inch square out of our stripe. That is larger than my shape cut, which only goes to 12. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually use the lines on my mat, which I don't love doing, but it's the only way I'm going to get that big of a square right now, and it's just fine. The mat's just fine. So I've got my fabric folded in half. My selvage is all lined up nice and neat. I'm going to line up my fold line with one of the lines here and just over one of these vertical lines on my mat, because I want to square that up. So I'm going to use my ruler, my longer ruler, and I have a line lined up with the fold line and then also with the line on the mat, and I'm going to go ahead and trim that up. Okay. And then since I need a 15 inch square, I'm going to count over 15 just to make sure and cut along that line. So 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 11 12 13 14 15. That makes sense. 4 plus 15 is 19. All right, so again, lined up with my fold line down here and along that line on my mat, go ahead and give it a cut. Now this piece is extra, we'll use that later. And then I'm going to open this up, and I only need 1 square to make 8 half square triangles. So I'm going to open it up and cut it at 1 layer, and the rest of it we're going to use for something else. So I'm going to go ahead and line up my cut line with one of the horizontal lines on my mat, and my selvage is just past one of the lines on the mat. It's that 4. So again, I'm going to line up my ruler with my cut edge. It's lined up with my cut edge down here and along that 4-inch line on my mat. Cut the selvage off. And then we're going to come down 15 inches and cut that. Now I'm going to do the same with my stripe fabric, and this is extra we will use for something else. All right, so now I'm going to take my lighter square, which is going to be the stripe here for me. And can you see it? Yes. And I'm going to draw 2 diagonal lines, one going this way and one going this way. And I'm gonna grab a longer ruler. I guess it's a good thing I have a lot of sewing tools. So I'm gonna draw, and I'm gonna use a ballpoint pen, although I would normally just use a mechanical pencil. But I want you to be able to see it, so I'm gonna draw a line from one corner to the opposite. And just, again, be careful and light with it. You don't want to stretch your fabric out. And then I'm gonna rotate it and do the same with the other two. Perfect. Now I'm going to take my squares and put them face together. And just to preview for you, if we're gonna sew a 1/4 inch, or for me a little bit more, on either side of the line going this way and either side going this way. And then when we cut them apart, what you'll end up with is 4 of these, which is our half-square triangles that we already made. So let's take it to the sewing machine and I'll show you how that's done. Okay, I've got my 2 big blocks and I've gone ahead and pinned them together along one diagonal and then along the other diagonal. So I'm gonna go ahead and sew with my little bit bigger than a 1/4 inch down each side of one line, and then I'm gonna flip it around and sew down each side of the other line. So we've got our big block with all of its stitching, and now we need to cut it apart into 8 half-square triangles. So the first thing to do is to line it up moderately on our mat. It might not be perfect anymore, but that is just fine. So I'm trying to line it up as best I can, both vertically and horizontally. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut through the center and then cut through the center this way. So I want to, as best as I can, line up my bottom and top lines with the edge of my fabric, the edge of my block, and the side here through the middle of that X, and go ahead and cut that. Then I'm going to take each of these pieces and rotate them and do the same through that point. And of course, I could have done these all at once and left them together, but that's okay. Now I've got 4 half-square triangle blocks that we can cut apart. So I actually am going to rotate them all the same direction, stack them up, because I'm a rebel and I believe it's going to work out. Hope it's going to work out. You want to have a sharp blade if you're going to do this, and make sure you're lined up as best as you can be. Or you can just cut them individually, that's fine as well. All right, now I've got all these half-square triangle blocks. So what I wanted to, the reason I picked a stripe for this is I wanted to show you that if you pick a directional fabric, a fabric that faces in a certain direction, like a stripe, or if it was like, you know, a picture on it or something that needs to go in a specific direction, like these stripes, they're going, if you make 2 at a time or 8 at a time, any, you know, multiple of 2, they're gonna end up where half of them are going one way and half of them are going another way. So I just need to be aware when I'm laying out blocks in the future using these, which direction my stripe's going, and what my intention is with that block. So I'll show you when we, I'm going to use these later. But I will show you how, if you have directional fabrics, you definitely want to lay out each block and plan accordingly. So I'm going to go ahead and give these a press and trim them up just like we have done with our previous blocks. We did it, 16 half square triangles, 8 of these, 4 of each of these because of the directional print. I've got them all pressed and trimmed and ready to go, and they are 6.5 inches perfectly. When they go into the quilt, they'll finish at 6. But wait a minute, we're not done here. Don't go anywhere. We are making 12-inch blocks, not 6-inch blocks. So what's the deal? Well, do you remember these? I have my 4 patches from last week's video, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'll leave a link up here and a link in the description to that video so you can watch and learn how to make 4 patches real easy. And I also cut up some 6.5-inch squares of my background and a couple other colors. And we are now going to combine these to make all kinds of cool different blocks. So let's get to that. I've got my 4 different piles of half square triangles. I've got my 2 piles plus this extra little random one of 4 patches. And then I've got my solid, my background, and my 2 other colors that I want to play with. And I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to set these aside, and I'm going to go ahead and play with some of my layouts. So for a 12-inch block using 6-inch, 6.5-inch squares, we need to put 4 together. So literally at this point, you've got all these blocks, just play with them. So maybe I got that guy and that guy. It's kind of cute. So if that's the block that I want to do, I'm going to take that to my sewing machine and I'm going to get it sewn together. I have brought my blocks over to my sewing machine in the same configuration that I have when I laid them out initially. And I'm going to go ahead and switch back to my 1/4 inch piecing foot because I do actually need to get a good 1/4 inch. And actually I'm going to switch back to a scant 1/4 inch. So I'm going to go ahead and move my needle however I need to for my machine. And what we're going to do to sew a 4 patch together, we've got these 4 pieces. So first I'm going to sew the first 2 together. I know this is backwards for you guys, but I'm going to sew these first 2 together, and then I'm going to sew the second 2 together, and I'm going to press them. And then I'm going to sew the 2 units together to form this larger block, and it should be 12.5 inches when I'm done. It will be 12 inches once it's put into the final quilt. So with these first 2, this is just like making a 4 patch. We've got 4 blocks. It's just that our blocks are more complicated because they have pieces. So the first 2, I'm going to flip one over the other. Now, generally, this is not a great example because they both are pieced, but generally I like to have the one that has multiple pieces, multiple seam allowances that I need to make sure are laying flat as I go on top. So I am going to actually flip this 4 patch over top of the half square triangle. And I don't have anything that needs to match up. Like, for example, if these 2 were going together, this point here would need to match up. So I'd need to do my nesting of my seams. I don't have anything like that. So I'm just wanting the block overall to line up. So I've got it lined up. I'm going to go ahead and pin it just because it's a more complicated block. I'm just going to pin it in a couple of places. As I sew, this seam allowance is facing like towards me. So as I sew, the presser foot will press it the right direction. And the same with this one on the back. It's facing towards the back of my machine, so I don't have to worry too much. But with the next ones, they're going to be facing forward, so we'll want to think about that. But I'm going to go ahead and take this over to my machine and give it the scant 1/4 inch if you're comfortable chain piecing, you could hypothetically go ahead and do the next one. I'm going to go ahead and take it off and return it to my table. Now I'm going to do the next one. And if I flip this, usually I flip right over left, but I've got this seam that I'm worried about. So I'm going to, it's the same seam, but I'm going to go ahead and flip it over. And that way, once again, my seam allowances are facing towards me, and I've got my more complicated block on the top. So as long as you're sewing down the correct side and you have everything matched up, then you're good. And then when I return it, I need to flip it back around. I'm going to go grab my iron. All right, so now, just like with any pressing, we're going to press it flat, and then we're going to press it to either one side or however we want. So first flat. If you're not sure which direction you want to press, one thing you can do is open it up and see kind of which direction it wants to lay. You can see that the half-square triangle, or yeah, the half-square triangle, the bulk is making it want to go this way, and the four patch is making it want to go that way. So you can split the difference and maybe press it open or just make your decision. I tend to think that the points on half-square triangles are a little bulkier, if that makes sense. There's a little more going on. So I'm going to press towards my 4 patch. I'm going to press it from the front as well. And if you wanted to, this would be a good opportunity to give it a little bit of maybe like best press or something like that, just to help it hold its shape a little bit if you're having, you know, issues or if you're unsure. So I'm going to go ahead and swap these. They are actually the same. So, and I'm going to do the same on this side. I'm going to press away from my half-square triangle, and that way the seams on these two, when they come together, are going to nest. Just like we talked about in our 4 patches, we want our seams to nest if possible. So I'll show you from the back if I can. So I've got this seam here is going up and this one's going down, so they're going to nest together a little bit easier. So I've got my block back on my table, and I'm going to flip my top one over my bottom one. And this time when I pin, I'm going to start in the center. I'm going to make sure that my seams are nested nice and tight, and I'm going to pin in that seam allowance. And then I'm going to go ahead and line it up along the block. I'm going to line up the end and pin the end. And then if you want to, you can pin again towards the center here. And I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to pin towards the beginning. And that way, if one of your blocks is, you know, a smidge, like a couple threads longer than the other, they shouldn't be because we trimmed. But if they are, you can kind of fudge it a little bit and kind of tug one of them a little bit and ease the other one in. So go ahead and do your center and then line up your ends first and then pin in between as needed. Now, as we sew this seam, we just want to make sure that we're really careful about these seam allowances, especially this one on the top. It's going to be going into our machine, towards our machine, but also we want to be really careful with the ones on the back side. So this one in the middle is going to be going towards the needle, so we want to maybe pause right before it and make sure that it's going the right direction. I like to just lift up, like I have my needle down. I always have my machine so that it stops with the needle down. If you have that function, that's great. If you don't, whenever you're going to stop, especially if you're going to lift your presser foot, make sure that you turn the wheel on the side here so that the needle is down. That way that you don't move it around and cause, you know, problems. But I'm just going to lift up and make sure that my seam allowances are going the right way so far. This one underneath is facing me, so I don't have to worry too much about it. When we get down here, this one's facing towards the machine, so I'm just gonna kind of run my finger under there and make sure it's laying flat, and then hold it. Make sure it gets fed in there the correct direction. This one I'm just feeding into the machine on the top. And then this half square triangle on the bottom is also facing towards the machine. So I just want to make sure it's laying flat. Okay. All right, so let's press set our seam once again. And then we need to press it either open or to the side. I think I'm going to go ahead and split the difference on this and press it open. It really doesn't matter. I mean, it does matter. It matters for when you're quilting. The bulkiness makes it hard to quilt over the joints in your quilt. And so that's why a lot of people like to press open for everything, is that it's a little bit flatter and there's less bulkiness. But you can, again, experiment with it and see what you like. It depends on the seam which one I do. I typically like to press to the side because it protects the thread as well. And it protects your batting when your quilt is finished and it's got batting in it and the backing and everything, it's quilted. If the seam happens to come out, then the batting isn't, if you press open, the batting is exposed, and if the batting gets damaged, it's a lot harder to repair the batting than it is to just sew up the seam or repair the fabric. So if it's pressed to the side and it comes open, you've still got this like layer protecting the batting to a certain extent. So there's that as well for long-term quilts. I'm gonna grab my starch real quick. Got a final block here, so I'm gonna give it a spray and go ahead and set all of this. Again, I'm not swishing or I'm not trying not to distort it, so I'm just moving my iron and pressing. There you have it. That's a beautiful block. Beautiful point in the middle. This background is going to just kind of fade away into the back of my quilt, especially if I use, I'm not sure exactly what kind of quilt I'm making yet, but especially if I use this background as the sashing as well, you'll just have this kind of, I don't know, butterfly or something shape pop out, and it'll be like floating on a background. So this is cool. I like this block. I might make another one. This would also be a great block for corners, like if you rotated them. And they would make some really cool designs if they're put together. So now let's play with a few different configurations. I've got, let's see, maybe a couple of them are going to be background, and you can literally do whatever. Play with it, turn it. That's kind of like an arrow situation. Maybe I want these to be this instead. That's interesting. I mean, maybe it's all these. I mean, there's so many things you can do here. We could do this. We could do this. Of course, these can be different colors. I want to show you with the stripes what I was talking about directions. So say I want to make it, but I want all the stripes to go this way. I can't do that. I mean, this is cool because that gives you like this swirly effect. I think I actually might make this one. But if I wanted all the stripes to be the same direction, I'd have to pick my other type, my other block, essentially. But honestly, I think I might make that one too. That's cool. So I'm going to set that aside. What else? I mean, that. And the cool thing is that you can create these different shapes by matching colors up that go together. It's the same thing here. This is completely different. So this background kind of fades away and all you see is this and then these guys. That's why I kind of like this where it's like pointing. I think I already did that, but it's like a kite almost. Well, upside down. Of course, you can just do solid squares. That's a large 4-patch. And maybe 1-air squares is an itty bitty 4-patch or something, you know? I mean, you can do whatever. So what I would like to see is come up with a bunch of different blocks. Come up with like 3 or 4 blocks and sew them together and see what you like. You can always make more 4-patches or more half-square triangles or plan these out ahead of time and make the appropriate half-square triangle and 4 patches that you need to make your block work. Ooh. How does this work? Chevron. So play with it. Make a few blocks. You don't need to use up all of your squares because we will use them in the future to make different types of blocks, but go ahead and play with it. Come up with a few blocks that you like. Maybe plan a couple and make the half-square triangles and the 4 patches for them specifically. And then we'll make other blocks after that. I went ahead and made the other 2 blocks that I was talking about. This is the chevron. And of course, if you repeated this a bunch of times, you'd have a really cool chevron. And that would just be half-square triangles. And these are all the same color, so you could make a whole bunch of them really, really fast. This one I wanted to make because I wanted to show off the different directions of the stripe. I really like this one. It is a little bit bulky because we've got these half-square triangle points meeting up together, so the seam allowances are a little bit bulky, but that's okay. And one thing I do want to show you, because these blocks are unfinished still, your point, it's not clear to the edge. It should be 1/4 of an inch about away from the edge there. So don't freak out if you use half-square triangles to make blocks and you're like, it's not matching to the point. It shouldn't. So these blocks now should be 12.5 inches so that when we put them into a quilt, they're 12 inches. And there's just so many combinations. This is only 3 of them, and there's probably 80 bazillion, and that's a made-up number, but you know, there's a lot that you could make with just half-square triangles and 4 patch blocks and some solids if you wanted to throw them in there. So I would love to see what you guys make. And next week we're going to pick up and I'm going to show you how to make snowball blocks, which if you can make a half-square triangle 2 at a time, it is very similar to that, just on a kind of different scale. And I'll show you how to use that in combination with these blocks to make other blocks, and then we'll see what other fun stuff we can come up with. So make a couple with this, try it out. Let me know if you prefer the 2 at a time or the 8 at a time in the comments, and let me know if you have questions. And if you learned something today, I would love it if you could give me a like and subscribe to the channel so that I can continue to teach you.